Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on all the top news stories from around the world. I'm Siddhantani, and with me on the show, as always, is Prashant from People's Dispatch. Hi, Prashant, welcome back.
Great to be back.
We're talking about a lot of big issues today, starting off with a global social media crisis in many ways. A tough week or month of news for Facebook, and a week that is just getting harder and harder. Former Facebook employee Frances Haugen came forward as a source of Wall Street Journal's stories, and on Tuesday testified before the US Congress about the harm she believes the social media giant is doing to children, democracy, and to the world at large. In a testimony, Haugen said a few important things that we must consider. First, the buck stops with the founder and chief executive Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook knows its systems lead teenagers to anorexia related content. The company had to break the glass and turn back on safety settings after the 6 January Washington riots. Facebook intentionally targets teenagers and children under the age of 13. And Monday's Facebook outage that brought down Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp meant that for more than 5 hours, Facebook could not destabilize democracy. We spoke first, a little while ago, to NewsClick editor-in-chief and resident techie Prabir Purkayastha to get a sense of what exactly is going on at Facebook and why it matters to all of us. Let's listen in.
Frances Haugen's exposes have come. The fact that she has given 60 Minutes interview to CBS, that she has also made 8 complaints to the SEC with the support of a whistleblowers organization called Whistleblowers Aid, I think. All this is significant not because it has said something we did not know, but it says these things with a plethora of evidence from internal records of Facebook itself that Facebook was completely aware of the problems and they knew what was happening and they privileged making money over the safety of the people and of course the rising hatred that has engulfed the use of social media increasingly today. Now, this is important also not because Facebook did not have quote-unquote people doing fact-checking. Of course, we know the fact-checking was very weak. We knew that it was really directed at English-speaking people and also at Europe and the United States, not rest of the world, where they hardly had any fact-checkers. And of course, the languages like, for instance, Hindi, English, Bengali, bunch of other languages when fact-checkers didn't really exist. But I think the most important part of it, and this is Haugen's central significant argument, is that the Facebook's internal evidence shows it was not the facts, it was not the people that was responsible for what we see, but it was really the algorithms. And the algorithms privileged what is called engagement. And engagement was driven by hate, it was driven by fake news, and this is the central significant element that comes up, which is supported by detailed investigations Facebook itself had carried out and seen that this kind of hatred leads to more engagement, fake news leads to more engagement, and news engagement or engagement on Facebook was the primary purpose of the Facebook platform. Keep people engaged on Facebook as long as you can so that you can sell them to the advertisers. Don't forget, 95% of Facebook's revenue comes from advertisements. So their business model was essentially to maximize engagement. For maximizing engagement, hate and fake news was promoted by algorithms. It did not need any conscious decision except to promote engagement. And I think that's a central issue that comes out of all of these revelations. Of course, there are all other issues also trying to get, like the cigarette companies used to try and get children to start smoking early. Similarly, to get what is called preteens, 9 to 12, how they can also be engaged with Facebook. All of these things are there. And Facebook is not just Facebook, it's also other platforms. It's WhatsApp, it's also Instagram, and so on. How they neglected the fact, or they did not bother to address the fact that young girls particularly were being addressed by so-called images of what the body should look like and promoted anorexia and also depression. All of this, of course, is there. This all there in the sideline, so to say. But the central message we are getting is, if you promote engagement, and that is something not covered by what is called Section 79 of the Indian IT Act or Section 230 of the US Communication Act, all of these things do not cover what is called the safety of the algorithms. It is the algorithms today which are responsible for the hatred and toxic environment we see on the social media platforms.
Right, Prashant, of course, Zuckerberg has now gone on the defensive, saying, this profit over safety and concerns about children are unwarranted and baseless. But beyond these unsubstantial kind of defenses, he's got a lot more to do.
Right. Well, in the sense that a lot of questions before Zuckerberg, importantly. But I think the key thing is that what is going to happen to Facebook in the coming months and years. So we know that in the United States, Facebook has become an issue on which both the Republicans and the Democrats actually agree for different reasons. But they're both, pretty much determined that there has to be some kind of action on Facebook. Now, time and again, Facebook has, of course, promised that, it is taking all the necessary steps possible. It has shown that it has some amount of capacity to do that. But what Frances Haugen points out is that these steps that it takes, whether it be, the impact on young people, whether it be the kind of virality that Prabir was talking about, whether it be the question of how democracies are being affected, these steps that it takes are only, they're not on all the time, so to speak. They vary widely depending on country, depending on, say, region, depending on language. For that matter, most of the resources are still dedicated to the United States. So, but whereas its impact is global. So India is a very good example of a country which is severely affected by the way Facebook functions. So really the question is that, is Facebook capable of, changing things? Right now, the evidence is not very positive. So it does look like whatever impact Facebook is having on the world, the negative impact, it will definitely continue because that is its business model. So there have been a number of proposals on what to do, really. Some people saying that...
about Facebook,
Yeah, some people saying that it makes sense to break Facebook down into, say, Instagram is one company, Facebook is one company, WhatsApp is one company, and that might reduce, say, the kind of sway it has. But as Frances Haugen pointed out, that does not really solve the problem of the algorithms. And the algorithms are really what, run everything, not only for Facebook, but also for Google, but also for Twitter, for all these digital media companies, which are having such an important impact on democracies. And all of these are basically gameable. So one of the things she pointed out was that, hate and anger are actually good for engagement because that is really how engagement works. You don't engage with social media in a very pleasant way often. You engage, you usually say stir to action, stir to anger, stir to emotion, whatever it be, stir to sadness, whatever the emotion be. So you're usually, motivated in some way to act on social media, right? And sometimes it's good, but oftentimes it's very, very bad. And there is no way of controlling that unless there is some kind of larger regulation. There is, of course, the fact that this can't be left to the US because it is, it is completely problematic that the United States alone have the ability to regulate social media, whereas the rest of the world does not. So actually, I suspect in the coming years and months, what we should be seeing at least is some kind of a global approach on this, on the question of algorithms, on the question of AI for that matter, on the question of the experiments social media companies are carrying out. There's a lot of information. Okay, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We do know that social media companies, for instance, carry out experiments on how people respond to things. So there's a lot of actually, I think, information that is still hidden, and there needs to be far, far more greater transparency. The exact concrete nature of some of these proposals is, it's still not clear. I don't think as a society we've actually reached this. There are some good ideas which call for a good balance between regulation and preventing surveillance. So it can't be, the government has all the power to, instead of private companies, your government alone has the power. So there has to be a good balance between the two. And I think that there are proposals that are coming up on these lines, but who will have the political will to, say, bind Facebook, bind these social media companies? What can be the nature of these global approaches is really the question. Because, for instance, in the European Union, we have seen that some of these social media and giants and internet companies, they face fines for various kinds of activities. And these fines don't really, matter much because for these companies, these fines are not that huge. They could be, but so far they haven't been. So that's really not the real way to solve the problem. So big challenges for Facebook and big questions. It's a good thing, I think, though, that more and more such information is coming out, because people increasingly in the know about how Facebook functions, how it's dangerous. On the other hand, this is still a very small percentage of the population who's aware of these issues.
But at least some amount of increasing pressure on publicly elected officials to at least consider these matters as important.
Right.
And perhaps also a sign of our times that we are talking about this story ahead of a story of a potential summit between the United States and China.
Absolutely.
So yeah, which is our next story, in fact. The two countries have agreed in principle for their presidents to hold a virtual meeting. Virtual, of course, because of COVID and other issues, before the end of this year, end of 2021. The news came from a senior US administration official on Wednesday after high-level talks aimed at improving communications between the two countries. The US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi held a closed-door meeting at an airport hotel in Zurich, their first face-to-face encounter after quite tense and a public airing of grievances in Alaska in March. US officials had suggested that the meeting was a follow-on from President Joe Biden's September 9 call with Chinese President Xi Jinping, prior to which the world's top two economies appeared to have been in some sort of a stalemate. Prashant, different signals emerging from the two countries, pretty much on a week-to-week basis. Are you looking at this as a positive development?
I mean, any sign of negotiation, any sign of discussion is always positive. Like you pointed out, the last time these two countries met at a high-level summit was in March in Anchorage in Alaska, and that was a disaster, for lack of a better word, because the United States approached that meeting from a huge moral high ground, which it does not have, and lectured the Chinese on a variety of topics. And no wonder the Chinese were very annoyed about it, and it would be natural, because, for instance, the United States cannot stop raising concerns about human rights violations, so-called human rights violations in China, where on the other hand, the violations of the United States are never to be questioned. The US refuses to accept any scrutiny of that. So a lot of such issues. But this round of engagement seems to have been much more positive. There seems to have been, like you said, the outcome is of a top-level summit on a variety, which is going to be discussing a variety of issues. So I think that's definitely a positive sign, especially because sections of the US establishment for the longest time have been pushing for a very antagonistic attitude towards China. This comes out in a lot of the documents. Recently, the Quad Summit, the AUKUS strategy, the Australia, UK, US alliance that was formed recently, all of these sort of seem to indicate that the US is really, trying to corner China in some way or the other. And it's important to also note that even some of the US withdrawals from West Asia or Afghanistan have been analyzed by experts as an attempt of the US to actually focus on what it sees as its real strategic rival, that is China. So that's really the question in terms of how so in that, considering all this, the fact that there is negotiation is definitely a positive thing. There needs to be more engagement, because what we do not want at this point is, as many experts have pointed out, is another Cold War. It's very essential that we do not go back to the second half of the 20th century, where there was this situation of constant rivalry, constant tensions. Like we talked before on this show, both these countries are nuclear powered nations. We do not want, on behalf of humanity, we can say that we do not want, anything close to tension between two Cold War nuclear powers.
Yeah. What is likely to be on the agenda, on the table when this summit does happen?
Right. I mean, a lot of questions, of course. I suspect there'll be a couple of standard issues the US always likes to raise, which are as much rhetorical points and, like I said, points to show moral superiority. But I suspect a key issue is definitely going to be trade, because the trade war that Donald Trump started, the restrictions it put on Chinese tech companies, it got its allies also to do that. Its attack on companies like Huawei, trying to stop the 5G network, Huawei's 5G network from expanding. All these are it still remains, these still are sore points. And we saw some amount of breakthrough when Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, was released from Canada. She went back to China, and she had been held in Canada for years at the behest of the US in house arrest. So that was a positive step. So I suspect trade is going to be one of those issues which they're going to really try to negotiate, talk about, because the US and China are still there's a huge amount of trade between them. So we can't ignore that fact. There is probably going to be some discussion on issues of security, on climate change, for instance. Now, climate change, again, both China has made some strong commitments recently at the UN General Assembly.
Yeah.
The US has also made some commitments. But there is a huge amount of space, not only between the US and China, but between countries of the global north and the global south. And some of this will come out in the COP26 meeting, which is coming up soon. So there's a lot of distance to be covered. So I suspect climate change will definitely be one of those issues that are going to be discussed. And some of these I think are very important to sort of to ensure that there is a much more, say the tempers cool down, there's lessening of tension, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that the Chinese will also raise issues of what they see as this kind of encirclement, and whether it'll come up for discussion or not is a different question, but that'll definitely be on the mind of the Chinese as well. So a lot of very, very key issues that do come up. The key element, of course, is how does the US balance its perspective of seeing China as a threat, as a long-term and a mid-term and a long-term strategic rival, versus the fact that China is also a trading partner, and the fact that the world needs to exist in a much less tense state, so to speak. So that's really the big question for the United States, so to speak, because China has been working, expanding its own commercial relations in Africa, in Latin America, many countries in Central Asia. The US trying to stop it in various ways as well.
Yeah.
So there's a huge, for lack of a better word, a geopolitical trade chessboard that's basically playing out right now. And the question really is that how do these two forces engage in these negotiations while knowing that their interests at some level both collide and at the same time can also be complementary.
Yeah.
So how do they balance this is really the question.
And fit in with the interests of the world at
Exactly,
large
exactly.
as well.
Exactly.
That's of course something we will be following in the coming weeks and months quite closely. And another developing story, something that's still a few months away, is France's upcoming presidential elections slated for 2022, where the far-right political pundit Eric Zemmour could reach apparently a second round runoff vote in the elections if he chooses to challenge the incumbent Emmanuel Macron, according to a new opinion poll that has just been released. The Harris Interactive poll, which was published on Wednesday, is the first since Macron won the presidency in 2017 to upend the widely held belief that he will face a repeat knockout contest against far-right leader Marine Le Pen in April next year. It's an increasingly crowded field, Prashant, as far as the French elections go. The Greens have announced Yannick Jadot as their representative, the Socialists likely to field Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo. What's going on in France? And who is firstly Eric Zemmour, and how has he kind of emerged as this face of the far right?
I mean, the popular, say, media description is to call him the Trump of France.
Right.
And this seems to be a comparison that he himself likes to enjoy. He's actually directly claimed that comparison as well. So Eric Zemmour is a TV star, for lack of a better word, a news analyst, a writer. And he is proposing an idea. He's a proponent of an extreme right-wing ideology. So what do we mean by an extreme right-wing ideology in a European context, or especially in a French context? It's basically talking about the French nation as some kind of pure, essential, there's something French about the French nation. And seeing immigrants, especially those who come from North Africa, other parts of Africa, even Asia for that matter, as basically people as foreigners of some kind. Nonetheless, the fact remains that the theory has its supporters, and one of the reasons is also due to the fact that in Europe there is a huge amount of poverty right now. There's a huge amount of I wouldn't say poverty; it's more the precarity of work right now. The government is withdrawn from multiple sectors.
Yeah.
There's a lot of insecurity. There's a lot of say that is one of the factors which led to the Yellow Vest protests in France, for instance. So all these factors, people like Eric Zemmour have really used all these factors to sort of propose a society where where you return to some ideal nature of France, where immigrants would be. For one of his controversial suggestions is that there should be only French first names. Right. So suppose your name is Mohammed, or suppose your name is some other, say a name from some other country. That those names should not be your first names for children. So that's just one example. But he's brought out a very far right-wing line, which is actually quite dangerous, but which still has its support. So we don't know what's going to happen by 2022. He may fade off. Right. But the fact that he actually has support is a very unfortunate sign for French society. Because until now, like you said, Marine Le Pen was considered
as far right as
the most extreme right person in French politics. Whereas, she also had a usual anti-immigrant quotations and positions and stuff. But Eric Zemmour is actually further to her right. But he also seems to be somebody who can bring together sections of the center right. So he's being seen as a much, probably to some extent right now, a much greater threat. But like we said, a long time ahead for the elections. Anything can happen in a few months, so it remains to be seen.
Macron himself is gaining in popularity a bit, particularly with dealing with how COVID has been dealt with in the later stages and things like that, at least in some sections. What is his standing as far as the upcoming elections are concerned?
Emmanuel Macron is basically difficult to categorize because he's basically a politician of the right, a center right, and he's sort of somebody who, one of those politicians across the world who doesn't really stick to an ideology and claims that he's above all these ideologies, so to speak. But actually, if you look at his record, it's been pretty bad. I mean, I wouldn't entirely agree that his handling of COVID-19 has been good. For instance, trade unions, health organizations have constantly gone on strikes and protests. Even recently, there was a health workers protest in France 2 days ago about the way COVID-19 was handled, about the way the funding of the health system has taken place. Similarly, education workers continuously protesting about how the education system is being affected by reforms. Then we have the very infamous pension reforms that he had proposed, which brought out some of the biggest protests France had seen in recent times by the trade unions, because what they proposed was increasing the age of retirement, reducing some of the benefits that they were going to get. All these very controversial reforms. So as far as the French workers are concerned, definitely I don't think that the mass of the French people are concerned. And like I said, there were the Yellow Vests protests before, which were actually quite huge in terms of the numbers they were able to mobilize. And that too week after week after week. So I don't know if Macron's popularity is really that high. What is possible is basically there is this idea of there not being a great alternative, which might finally work in his favor, which is what the polls show as well, that he's likely to win over most of these candidates because what the other candidates offer is so bankrupt that he seems slightly better off by comparison. So that's about what he's bringing to the table, which is really not much. But I think this also points to a large question among many of the leaders and politicians of Europe, that they are right now in a situation of they're so closed by their policies that they're unable, whether it be Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, the new German government which is going to be formed, or take any country in Europe for that matter. They're so closed by the nature of their own policies. They're not able to spend on important services for people, so that the economies are basically straitjacketed or crushed.
Constricted,
That there is very little option for many of them. And that, I think, is one of the great tragedies of Europe right now. The fact that many countries across the world, but especially Europe, the fact that they are in a state of continuous decline because of their own economic path that they had chosen. So Emmanuel Macron also in one of those positions.
Fair enough. We'll keep an eye on that as things develop. And finally, today we're talking about Israel's NSO group and the now, I think, world-renowned Pegasus spyware. The latest development on that story has been that the NSO group has ended its contract with the United Arab Emirates for the use of the Pegasus spyware because Dubai's ruler was using it to hack the phones of his ex-wife and some of her entourage. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, who is Vice President of the UAE and Prime Minister as well, asked for 6 phones belonging to Princess Haya bint Al Hussein, her lawyers and some of her security team to be hacked using the spyware. The revelations came in the form of a judgment from a UK court in the context of the couple's ongoing custody battle over their 2 children. Prashant, while it's great to see NSO sort of unilaterally terminating contracts based on when it gets into family disputes, the stance seems a bit of convenient morality, I think.
Right. I mean, the NSO statement was the NSO statements that appeared in the media, they were very gung-ho about how, the moment we see any kind of misuse, we take immediate action. But I think this is a question that a lot of journalists and activists, a lot of, say, political dissidents across the world also are asking that, hey, what about us? So when did we become terrorists? Is a journalist a terrorist? Jamal Khashoggi, his phone was, Pegasus was used on him apparently. He was murdered brutally in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. So what about him? So this news, I think, is one of those items where the irony really stands out because, of course, it's very good that Pegasus was not used after a point on the ex-wife of the UAE royal, so to speak. But really the question is, what about the other people, the hundreds of maybe thousands of other people across the world who were targeted, and we saw a lot of news about them. What about all them? Did they deserve that as well? Where was NSO's conscience and morals at that point of time? A very important question to ask, and I think that any news that comes out from NSO is something that we need to keep tracking precisely for that reason, because the amount of damage done to upright people in society
And public institutions.
exactly it's impossible to calculate, so really something to watch out for.
Yeah. Thanks for all of the inputs, Prashant, and we'll be catching up with you again tomorrow on the show. For now, you've been watching Daily Debriefs. I'm Siddhant Ani, and thank you for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow. Goodbye.